welcome everyone here. I'm super happy to be here today discussing the role of the scientific community in today's situation, which is the COVID pandemic. We're going to talk about all the challenges that society and the scientific community has faced during this crisis, and what solutions also have been working so far, what hasn't been working, and at different levels. I'm going to start by reading a little introduction, and then I'll also introduce the guests who are here. So in the wake of the worldwide spread of SARS-CoV-2, these last few weeks have seen world leaders sending out mixed messages and trying to trace a path on a moving terrain with questions like social distancing, wearing of masks, and lockdown. On another front, while doctors, epidemiologists, and virologists have been working around the clock to understand COVID-19 and take control of the pandemic, and to advise politicians and policy deciders, we've seen a movement of disinformation and conspiracy theories that has been gaining traction and visibility, with video content circulating and passing on fake news that is tricking the general public into lending it a credibility that it doesn't deserve. In our live discussion today, we are going to talk about the challenges this pandemic has faced the scientific community with. We are going to discuss what role researchers and the scientific community at large can play during a world crisis such as this one. And we are going to try and get a wide-angle view of how the scientific community has been impacted at the policy level, at the level of universities, and at the community level. To discuss these issues today, I have with me Dr. Adriana Bankston, Dr. Joana Lobo Antunes, and Dr. Mónica Feliú-Mójer. Dr. Adriana Bankston is a principal legislative analyst at the University of California Office of Federal Governmental Relations in Washington, D.C. Prior to this position, she was a policy and advocacy fellow at the Society for Neuroscience, where she provided staff support for special and ongoing projects, including SFN's annual lobby event and the Society's annual meeting. In addition to working at UC, Adriana also serves as the Director of Communications and Outreach for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, JSPG, and is an associate member of the Public Policy Committee with the American Society for Cell Biology. For the past several years, Adriana has also been an active member in the nonprofit organization Future of Research, where she's currently the vice president and has previously served as the associate director of fundraising and strategic initiatives. Adriana received her bachelor's in biological sciences from Clemson University and her PhD in biochemistry, cell, and developmental biology from Emory University. Welcome to this roundtable, Adriana.
Thank you for having me, David.
It's my pleasure. Now, we also have around the table someone from Portugal, Dr. Joana Lobo Antunes. Joana Lobo Antunes is head of communications at Instituto Superior Técnico and Engineering faculty at the University of Lisbon in Portugal. She is lecturer in science communication and social media for scientists in the Nova University in Lisbon. She's also coordinator of a science radio show called 90 Seconds of Science, also in Portugal, and founder and current president of the Portuguese Science Communicators Network, SciCompT. Joana has previous experience as a researcher, PhD in organic chemistry, and as a university professor, having transitioned to a position as a professional science communicator at Universidade Nova de Lisboa in 2012. Her main interests are the use of theater improvisation techniques and storytelling in science communication. Joana also has been engaging scientists to use social media tools to connect and interact with peers and laypersons, improving science visibility and the public image of scientists. Welcome, Joana.
Thank you, David. It's very nice to be here with this great panel, and you.
Thank you. I'm really eager to have everyone start talking, but there's one person who I still need to introduce, who is Dr. Mónica Feliú-Mójer. Mónica uses cultura to connect underserved communities with science. As a science communicator, she draws on her training, a PhD in neurobiology, personal background and culture, a woman from rural Puerto Rico, to make science relevant and relatable, especially to Puerto Ricans and Latinos. Dr. Feliú-Mójer understands the importance of storytelling and using a cultural lens to empower people and change stereotypes about science and scientists. To do this, for the past 14 years, she has led multiple science communication efforts, from publishing a book, to producing short films, to training scientists in culturally relevant science communication with the nonprofits Ciencia Puerto Rico and iBiology. Welcome, Monica. I'm really happy you could make space in your busy schedule to be here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all.
The first thing I would like to do, now that we're all here and that we're live, is that I would like to hear how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected you and your professional day-to-day at the present time. What has changed since the pandemic was declared? And to start, I'm going to ask Monica. Monica, I know you're in an all-hands-on-deck situation down there, from what we've talked before, collaborating with Puerto Rican scientists and media daily. Can you share with us the issues you're dealing with and the solutions you've been finding so far?
Yeah. To answer your first question, sometimes I feel like I'm running an Ironman every day. So it's been incredibly busy. I lead communications for Ciencia Puerto Rico, which is a nonprofit that brings together anyone with an interest in science in Puerto Rico and taps into the collective knowledge of that community to create social impact through science communication, through education, and through professional development for young scientists. And since the pandemic began, our community has been very, very active in addressing different challenges in Puerto Rico, from misinformation. We're collaborating with the media, different media outlets in Puerto Rico and beyond, to publish op-eds, to publish articles, to connect scientists, to do radio, TV, written press interviews. We've also been doing a lot of advocacy to nudge the government of Puerto Rico to use science to drive their decision and policy making during this pandemic. We've been also addressing challenges in terms of testing in Puerto Rico. There's been issues with testing, certainly across the United States, of which Puerto Rico is a colony. But in Puerto Rico, there's been a shortage of testing. Tests are not being used properly. And so we're very engaged in promoting proper use of tests and also in increasing the capacity of testing, particularly the molecular PCR testing that detects the virus. And finally, we've also been engaged in several education initiatives to support the continuity of education, because as we know, children are not going to school and their education has been interrupted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at this point, I'm going to say that I have my two kids at home with me. So if listeners out there hear some background noise, it's going to be them. They're doing well. They're playing video games right now. But yeah, I think a lot of us are living this reality of having children at home because schools are closed. We're going also to talk later about universities that are closed, and because that's also a big issue, because there's research out there, and research is important for the pandemic. So I just wanted to mention that if there's some extraneous noises. But the important point, the important thing that I would like to hear is also, because I feel from the conversation we've had before that you have your pulse on what's happening on the streets in Puerto Rico in terms of the difficulties that people are having understanding the right guideline, or understanding the guidelines well, applying them. Can you talk a little bit about that? How is the population dealing with this? The population who may be less educated or less prone to follow orders or guidelines or to make changes in their daily life. What are you seeing on the streets that is not helping with the pandemic?
Overall, all things considered, I think the people of Puerto Rico have been incredibly graceful, and they've been doing great in terms of following orders to stay at home. Puerto Rico, in the context of the United States, they were the first jurisdiction to establish very strict stay-at-home orders. And by this point, there's still a curfew in place until mid-June, and people have been under curfew and some form of curfew for over 70 days at this point. I'd say the people of Puerto Rico have responded really well. One of the issues that I see is, of course, there's a lot of misinformation that's making the rounds on social media, but even on traditional media, even from government officials. Last week, we had our Secretary of Health wrongfully say that getting infected with this coronavirus would be similar to getting a vaccine, which is absolutely not true. It's very different to get infected than getting a vaccine. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation. The government has a serious credibility issue, which is a big problem when you're trying to get the population needs to trust you as the government in order for them to follow instructions that are designed to protect their health. And so there's been misinformation, and there's a problem with credibility, but there's also, on behalf of the government, there's certainly been the guidance hasn't always been communicated properly, or in some cases it hasn't really been science-based.
Yeah, that's definitely serious, because people will look at the governing bodies and the people who are ahead of all of these big organizations or governmental organizations as people who are in the know and who will give the right information. And if they're not disseminating the right information, we have a problem for sure. And
right. And on top of that, I'll just briefly add that because of Puerto Rico's political relationship with the United States, it means that we're under U.S. regulations, and frankly, the response from the federal government has also been lackluster.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do have some questions for Joana later on the Portuguese example, but I'll leave them for when the moment comes. But this is an important point, which is how can the scientific community interact with government bodies to bring the right messaging to the public, and to be able to put the brakes on things that are just blatantly wrong. We've heard a bunch of them in the last few weeks about hydroxychloroquine, for example. Monica, just a question still for you. Apart from this statement, which is really, really disturbing, that herd immunity is equivalent to vaccination. What other maybe misinformation have you seen circulating? There's this documentary out there that is really damning, and that is really, it has a high production value, I'd say. So someone who's less informed will look at that, and it seems like something that is coming from a bona fide source. What have you seen, like in the nature? What's making the rounds there in terms of misinformation that you've seen, and that's really disturbing?
I mean, there are different types of misinformation, from treatments to ways to avoid infection. One thing I will say is that nowadays there's like this documentary that you're mentioning. There a lot of misinformation is wrapped in half truths, and some of the people that are spreading misinformation, they're in positions of power, and they're using very sophisticated tactics, saying like, a scientist from this university said this, and so I think it's important to understand that because we are in very uncertain and scary times, people are searching for certainty. Humans, want certainty. And so it is very difficult. And so sometimes it can be extremely hard to determine whether or not something we're seeing on social media is true or not, because the way that these things are framed really play into our human nature and the way our brains work, in the way that, we want certainty, that we're scared of change or novelty. So I think it is important for people to understand that people, most people are not consuming misinformation because they want to believe things that are false. It is coming from a fact that it is uncertain. People are scared and they're searching for something, they're searching for something that's confirming their values, what they believe in. And so I think it is important that we understand that. And then it's also important that we have, certain easy rules in mind. If you see something that you're like, oh, this creates a very strong emotion. Like I read it and I'm like, yeah, this is absolutely true. How dare these people do this? Take a moment and question the information that you're reading. Just question what, why, how, who is this person saying this? Where's this information coming from? What is the source? We have to really apply our skepticism because these are unprecedented and uncertain times. And everybody has a responsibility to question what they're seeing online.
That's true, and I do want to talk later on the role of educating the upcoming generations of citizens and how to try to see whether things are being done in that domain to ensure that the next generations are going to be more informed and more capable of critical thinking. Now, Joana, I'm going to Joana. Mónica is tackling a very challenging problematic, which is making sure scientific information to do with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 reaches a wide public as wide as possible. And I'm seeing a comment here on Facebook. Brenda Reyes Tomasini is saying a lot of the decisions made by the government of Puerto Rico are not made by scientists regarding coronavirus. And I see Mónica is agreeing. Also, one other thing that Mónica is trying to do is to do all this in a language and a format that is adapted to all groups, cultures, and identities across a large population. Now, Joana, in your case, being responsible for the science communication within an engineering faculty, what has the impact of the pandemic been on your work and on the faculty itself?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, it's the political decisions have to be made by politicians, not by scientists, but they have to be science-based. So that's the role of the scientists, to give the knowledge so that politicians can make the best decision possible based on the best information. That if you do the wrong decision, it's not because you don't have the science, it's because you don't want to make the best decision. So it's not up to scientists to do politics. That's the politician's job. In regard to my life, my life has changed very much, because for the first couple of days it was really smooth because we all came home. My kids came home, so for a couple of days it was like, okay, I can do this. But then kids started having school at home, so that's challenging. And then as a working family person, I have a lot of work to do. I certainly have a lot more work to do at the house and with the kids. And also because regarding my workload has increased a lot. Although I work in engineering faculty, that we don't deal with life sciences, and so we are not so much committed into explaining COVID to people, but rather engineers are very much, okay, I don't want to stay home. I want to do something to help society tackle this problem. So we had everybody at Technico doing something. They were either doing medical shields with 3D printers, or doing disinfectants to take to hospitals, or they started doing the kits, because you need to collect the samples to do the testing, because testing, we got to a point that we need testing. We need a lot of testing, because that's the way you know how many infected you have, and those are symptomatic and so forth. And so we needed two things. We needed ways to get the samples out of people and ways to test large. So we have one lab doing the testing, the actual testing and the RT-PCRs, and we have another consortium in which Technico is involved, that we constructed the kits to collect the samples because they were not available in Portugal. We could not import because there were other countries that were in much in worse state than Portugal, so they had the kits and not us. So we had to build our own kits. So engineers were working a lot. They were doing so many things, and also some informatic engineering students. They come up with a video game to help kids know how to deal with the coronavirus, what are the security measures, and also the pharmaceutical engineering students, they come up with a game, another game that is being distributed in schools to help kids know what's their level of knowledge. So this all means that as a head of communications, I wanted to put this information out for everybody. And also, when we locked down the university, because we have 12,000 people in our faculty, we had to be very clear about how to communicate the lockdown. But now we are opening up. And opening up is way more challenging than just locking down, because lockdown, you just close down the doors and you send everybody home. Now we're opening up slowly, and we have to have a lot of security measures because 12,000 people, that's a lot of people. So we need to think very clearly and have a very clear strategy on how to do that safely, and also to communicate that strategy very clearly so that everybody knows what's happening, because of two reasons. Because people need to know the safety measures, but they also have to feel safe. I don't know in your countries, but now we are tackling this problem, is that we closed down everything for over 2 months. We said, everyone stay home, don't go out. And now we are saying we can start to go out, and people, well, some people are very happy in going out too much, but most people are really afraid to take a public transportation, to go to work, or how to deal with going to work. So there's a lot of work to be done on science communication and on communication of risk communication to people. So I've been working a lot.
It's true that there was a lot of emphasis on, and I'm going to say it like this because it's the right word, on kind of instilling fear into people to make them stay home. And
Yes.
Now the opening up to take out this fear and this defensive attitude, that also will need to be science backed. And
Yes.
I agree. Scientists will have to be maybe not on the forefront, and we might talk about that later on, but instructing what messaging should be shared with people. It's a big challenge, I imagine, for policymakers and politicians, and it's a very good point. Actually, just out of curiosity, Monica, at what stage of things are you seeing things happening in Puerto Rico? Is it still ramping up in terms of numbers? Is the lockdown still in complete? Complete. The recommendation for lockdown, is it still going on?
Yeah, so there's still a curfew until mid-June. Yesterday, the reopening of businesses, they moved on to an advanced phase, even though, Puerto Rico doesn't meet the criteria for reopening. It doesn't meet any of the criteria for reopening. And, the testing system is not appropriate. The contact tracing is not yet in place after 3 months. Almost, and hasn't been a decrease in number of cases. I mean, the data, there's a lot of issues with the reliability and transparency of data in Puerto Rico. And so, in my opinion, we are just opening blindly, mainly due, following economic pressures and not really being science-based.
There's no science-based reason. Okay. No, it's I think a lot of countries and regions are experiencing that, and have this feeling that economy has to resume, and that's a hard thing to balance for sure.
Yeah, I mean, science doesn't happen in a vacuum, and of course, as Joana said, I agree, but scientists don't make policies, like they inform policies, and It is the responsibility of elected officials and people in government to listen to the scientists, to make those policies. And so it is important that to understand that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there are other aspects of other societal issues that need to be taken into account. It can't just be about public health, but regardless, things should be evidence-based. And of course, there are economics, there is science in other fields, there's social sciences that can be used to inform these strategies, and they're not.
Yeah, it's a strange situation in many aspects, but I feel that the last few years have seen a tendency towards having economic goals in front of everything, and we're seeing it again in this situation. And there's a pressure. There's a lot of pressure to reopen, and it's a bit concerning that in places where things are not flattening and there's no reason, the pressure is there. The pressure is there. But again, I'm talking as someone who is not a politician or an economist, and I don't really have the full grasp of the impacts of staying closed longer. I do, when I think of what's happening in Brazil, I do feel for the people who are just putting back in contact with the virus that might end their lives. It's a bit distressing in that sense. Joana, I had the last question for you in this part, which is about faculty. You said that labs are scrambling to find solutions, build things. It's an engineering faculty for sure. Is there anything happening in your faculty in terms of the communication aspect, or not so much?
I don't know what do you mean.
If I don't know, scientists have been called to be on shows on TV.
Yeah. Well, they have been called to talk about their work. I'm remembering one of the centers. They've built a risk map. They are they do natural resources and stuff, and they got at the map with the numbers of the infections, and they tried to understand the distribution and the risk of infection. So now they're working with the authorities of health in Portugal, helping them devise which are the riskier areas, so they know where to act more severely in order to contain the infection. They've been around talking about their science a lot, and we in the communication office have been helping with that. And they come up to us and we say, we have this project, and we help them get that project out to the public. And we have also arranged for a website where we collect everything that we are being done. And regarding Corona, that's it.
And just I want to start. I want to ask Adriana a question, but just before, I just wanted to ask you, because it's an engineering faculty. Do you know if there's been any projects in terms of tracking software? There's been a lot of questions.
Yeah, they're working on that. They're working on apps for that, but that in that regard, there has been a lot of discussion here on the media and between the scientific community and with the state, which is the tracking devices. Are they more useful than dangerous? Because there's the dangers of your personal data. Is the government collecting your personal data? Yeah, on the ethics around it, and the data protection, of course. So we really need scientists to help us and guide it, and also politics, because in the end it's a political decision, but it has to be, as I said before, based on the best science and the best knowledge possible.
For sure. I'm very curious to see what happens on that end. Of course, there's a lot of worry about privacy, and I imagine, well, in places like China and I imagine Korea also, they've been pretty good at that, probably because of the experience they had also before with MERS. But it's something that in our societies, I don't think it's going to be so easy to implement, but it's interesting to see how the scientific community also has started thinking about those questions and thinking about, how can we create a solution that's secure, safe, and that will help epidemiologists and to see what's happening, to see how the disease and to stop the disease from spreading as fast as it is. Thanks, Joana. Now, Adriana, I know the situation in the universities, namely the University of California, and I just want to remind the listeners that the opinions of the people at this roundtable are their personal opinions. Adriana maybe is going to have a statement of her own. But still, I wanted to ask you, because you are in the policy domain, you see what's happening in terms of universities from another level, from the policy level. I know also that you've been pretty busy lately also with all that's been happening in the university universe with the pandemic. But I would like you to describe to us the impact that COVID-19 and the pandemic has had on the US academic landscape so far. What impact do you and other policymakers foresee that lockdown may have on research?
Okay, thanks, David. So it's a big question. There's a lot of aspects. So I'll just start by talking about generally, if you think about the value of the university, which is research, education, public service, helping the community. So it really covers all of these aspects. And in particular, for what we were talking about, what it means for somebody to be a scientist in the times of COVID, because you are doing research, but I think we have to keep in mind sort of the community angle as well. So in my position, we're looking at essentially showcasing the value of research on campus to representatives on the Hill through different events. So we've had to definitely shift our events to virtual meetings with staffers on the Hill. So that's been interesting. Being sort of at the nexus between academia and policy, there are concerns related to what will happen, whether universities will open in the fall, what are the ramp up costs, whether they will be open, whether social distancing will be part of that, or there's a lot of variation across universities from what I've heard in terms of who will open and what that looks like. Financially, it's a concern in terms of what the ramp up will look like. The research also, obviously there's much more funding going to COVID projects. So there's also the question of what the actual research will look like when people go back in terms of being able to continue their work, or whether they'll actually shift to more COVID type of things. And that also obviously affects the students and postdocs who are in those labs as well. I think one positive that has come from this is there have been a lot more collaborative work between basic researchers and those in public health, for example, or topics around pandemics and things like that. So it could potentially lead to more collaboration in the system in the future. And then the last part of this is turning to grad students and the workforce in general. So obviously they're unable to do their work now because they're at home. So there has had to be a lot of creativity in terms of how do we maintain their education, teaching virtually, creative methods to teach and help them continue to build their professional development. There have been virtual defenses, graduations, all kinds of things, which is sad, but everyone is adapting, I guess. And I think one of the questions is also, obviously, a lot of people are applying for jobs and thinking about where grad students and postdocs will go, whether this will affect their ability to stay in science or not. So I can imagine that might be demoralizing if you're not able to work, and you might think, maybe I'll pick something else. And so it has a potentially larger effect in terms of the workforce and the scientific system overall. The fact that all of these promising young scientists are not able to do what they're trained for. So I think, and I think kind of to look back to the beginning, I think it's important to think about how we're also training scientists to be successful in policy careers or to inform policymakers, as we've discussed, and use their expertise in that sense. And so I think it's interesting that to think about policy also becoming another career for them, because they are obviously able to kind of showcase their research and the value of what they do in society. So that's another thought of sort of how will they sort of link what they know outside of the university.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about the students for sure, and but you went there yourself. I imagine there's a lot of sadness for people who have these graduations that are now on Zoom, maybe, and they don't, they don't get to wear the regalia. They don't, they don't get to live that experience in that same way. So it's kind of, if this generation who's either starting university, because there's also those who wanted to start their studies now, right, or to start their graduate studies, who are now in this kind of limbo of what's happening. Are we going to be able to go? Is it all going to be Zoom? And then teachers, professors, scrambling to learn how to teach in this manner. I think those are really, really important points, and I imagine, and from what I've been seeing, there's a lot of ingenuity. People have been having a lot of ingenuity on how to really quickly adopt these new media and to bring something of value to the student body. Joana, do you have in Portugal an idea, or do you have the kind of a picture of what's happening on that side, the student body, or is everyone having virtual classes? Is everything rolling well, or what are the challenges, or what are the really cool solutions that have appeared?
Well, I'm not giving classes this semester in my university, but in the university that I'm working in, everything has gone online, and they have gone through a lot of effort to understand if it was going to work. But one of the problems of all going online is, well, this is spectacular. We can teach long distance, but we have the practical classes, the lab classes. It's not possible to do long distance with quality. And then there's another problem, that the long distance classes, I can see that also with my kids, not just in university, it came it dug the gap between classes, because there are many people that don't have the money or don't have the means to follow classes with quality long distance, because they don't have computer, or they don't have quality Wi-Fi, or they don't have a room big enough where they can be alone. So what I think is going to happen, and there's one thing that we are very worried, and we were trying to tackle that problem, is that addressing students with financial needs, because those will be education will not be granted for all. And this in university is a problem, but it's also a problem in earlier stages of education, because not all my kids are under 10, and not all kids under 10 have parents that can get them computers or tablets or printers and earplugs and everything they need to do their classes quietly and with quality. So I think on one side, it's spectacular the way we have adapted to long distance, doing the classes online, doing evaluations online, changing everything, using all the techniques and all the tools available possible. But there's also the problem that we need to address, and we need to address very, very, very together and very frontally. Do not forget this, because it will increase inequalities. It will increase inequalities, the long distance learning.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I've felt this here. Even teachers, elementary school teachers, not all of them have the same laptop with a webcam or whatever. And then different parents around me have had different experiences of this whole COVID lockdown, of having no resources to find a curriculum for their kids, or some of them are very structured because the teacher is on Zoom with and has phone calls, etc., etc. No, it's a very, very good point, and it actually segues to what I wanted to talk next, which is to go a little bit more into what role academics and scientific organizations are having and can have during this pandemic. And yeah, I mentioned it before. So these last few weeks, I've seen the surfacing of a host of fake news, misinformed statements by government leaders, conspiracy theories that have fostered movements of COVID skepticism and resistance to health and safety guidelines. And one of the obstacles, of course, one of the things, of course, is to make sure that the news, the right news, the true news are out there and have the spotlight. But there's also the question of bringing the message to the public in a language and in a way that talks to them, right? And that will reach them intellectually and emotionally, and that will make them act upon what they heard. Monica, the question is for you. Based on your experience on the ground, and you've already alluded to it a little bit, because you said that the governor, the person who's governing now, the role is escaping me, but that he was making a statement that was totally not science-based. But the question is, how well has the scientific community been able to push back against misinformation that's been surfacing about the coronavirus and COVID-19? And given the problems you've identified and you're dealing with in Puerto Rico, how can scientists develop and deploy culturally appropriate solutions in this context?
In Puerto Rico, the scientific community has been incredibly active and engaged in communicating the science and the implications in different sectors of society of COVID-19. We were trying our best to address misinformation, but I can't compete with the Secretary of Health, was the person you're thinking about. His platform is way bigger than mine, and so while we're doing our best, I think in terms of his the expressions and the comments he made, the damage is done. Once misinformation is out there, is hard to combat because people become familiar with it, and so it's a tricky thing to do. However, we've been very active. I will say I have been really encouraged by the visibility that scientists in Puerto Rico, that's my experience is predominantly in Puerto Rico, that scientists have. I never thought I would hear a government official talk about PCRs pretty much every day. I'm talking about PCRs multiple times a day in the media. And so I think there are some encouraging signs and opportunities in terms of the visibility of scientists, in terms of people want to hear from scientists. In Puerto Rico, I mentioned there is a lack of credibility in the government. And although, we don't really have surveys that tell us, the population in Puerto Rico trusts in science. This is where the trust stands. Like in the United States, there are regular surveys that measure trust on scientists. We don't have that in Puerto Rico. But from my experience, people trust scientists. They want to hear from them. They believe that scientists have their best interest in mind. I've certainly been seeing an increased interest from the media. And so one of the approaches that we've taken with Ciencia Puerto Rico, we're a digital platform. And so we're using all of the digital tools that we have at our disposal. We're collaborating with print newspapers. We're collaborating with TV, with AM radio stations in Puerto Rico. Radio and TV and print newspapers are still heavily read and watched and listened by the population. And so we're using different platforms to engage different types of the population. Our core approach has always been to make science culturally relevant. So, use messengers that look like people, sound like their audience, so that people can see themselves reflected in these scientists, to see that, we're just regular Puerto Ricans like them. But also to use the lingo, the popular cultural references, so that people can really grasp how things are relevant. Why the things that we're why does wearing masks, like, what is that? Is that important? So, I think when looking at other places and scientists trying to engage with their own communities, thinking about, how do I meet people where they are? How do I connect the science, the concepts and the importance of those concepts that you're trying to convey? How do you connect that with the reality of people, with the things that people care about, with their values, with their beliefs? How do I use that to engage them in a conversation? that's going to be really important.
Yeah, and it's really important. It must be quite challenging. And what you just said elicits in me a question, which is this counterweight or this balance between, packaging the messaging well for different publics, having the right messages, and that's a very interesting point. A person that looks like them, I hadn't thought of that before. And that does the other thing that I kind of alluded to before, which is bringing up the scientific literacy of the population at large. And the question is, and I kind of want to send the question to Joana and Monica. Are these two separate issues, and what role can the scientific community play in either one? Because I feel that they are, but I would really like to have your opinion. Maybe Joana first.
I was still stuck with what Monica said, because well, the work that we have been doing in the past few years, it's been much of that. And I was discussing science communication in Portugal with other colleagues just last week, and we talked about that. There's the value of proximity. You cannot change mentalities if people feel that the scientists are over there and I am over here. People want to listen to scientists, but then there's this problem that scientists are kind of they speak weird. They don't speak the same, they don't use the same words as we do. So as science communicator, one of the things that we have been working on is on making them use this different set of words so that people can relate to them. And also one of the most important things is that you never ever wear a lab coat. You wear your street clothes when you go talk to people. You don't take your lab coat, because that immediately creates a distance. And that's the stereotype, So coming back to your question, I really wanted to add this, because this is really important to do effective science communication, is working on proximity. And that's the clothes you wear, the words you use, the language you use, the way you frame your science. So you really need to reset those tools. And that makes all the difference between people actually hearing you or just saying, I'm doing this because they said so, or I really understood what he said. I'm not just trusting my life because he's a scientist, he or she is a scientist, but because I understood, it spoke to me, and I can relate to that. And this is very important, not the authority argument, but the empathy argument. This is super important. And the work you are doing in Puerto Rico with using Spanish, many times when I give classes to scientists to help them engage better language, it's completely different if I can do the course in Portuguese, or I have to do it in English because I have foreigners, because people are doing their PhDs over here. And it's completely different. All the body language changes, and the way you contextualize your science, if you're talking your mother language or you're talking in English, it's completely different. And it's very interesting to see that happening. So I really think the work you're doing in Puerto Rico is super, super important, and using the language. Sorry, David, I lost your question, because I really wanted to react to this.
You make a really good point, and I can only imagine, because she talks. Monica was talking about running an Ironman every day, and I'm sure that this groundwork must be very, very taxing, and eventually very rewarding. But right now, it must be tiring for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. But the question was adapting the messaging versus bringing up the scientific literacy.
That's a huge challenge, because of course there's the question of the language and the empathy, but you have to be very clear on this word means this and not something else. So we have to find an equilibrium, So it's sometimes when I'm coaching a scientist on how he or she can talk about that to the general audience, I say, well, can we say that in a different way? And they say, no, I really need to use this word. And I say, okay, you use that word, but you explain what it means, because otherwise people will not get it, because there are so many words that we use I'm talking general words now, like risk. People listen to risk and they think of danger. When scientists talk about risk, we are talking about probabilities. So sometimes just framing it differently is if we talk about theories, people think it's just an idea, and many times theories are proven, like the theory of evolution. Okay, so we have to remember sometimes the words we use have different meanings for the people that are listening to us, but other times we really need to use those words. Like if I'm talking about mitochondria, I have to use the word mitochondria, but then I have to explain what a mitochondria is, and then I can continue using it, and sometimes I can continue to saying mitochondria, comma, the organelle inside the cell that gives me energy, you know. So yeah, it's challenging. It's challenging.
Mm-hmm.
It's challenging.
Monica, do you have an idea of how things are going in terms of education, basic education, you know, from kindergarten to you know, in Puerto Rico, in terms of scientific literacy? I know there's a lot of accent that's being put on STEAM, you know, and STEM. How are things, you know, down in Puerto Rico going in that sense? What's the next generation going to look like when something like COVID hits 30 years from now?
I don't know. You know, one thing I wanted to add to what Joana was saying is when you're communicating, your audience is you always have to center your audience. It's never about you as a communicator, it's always about your audience. So you always have to begin from a place of respect and empathy for that audience. So when you're thinking about what are the words that I'm going to choose, you shouldn't think about, you know, what is it that I want to say is, why does this matter to my audience? How do I frame it? How do I present it in a way that they're going to be able to understand it, to use that information? You know, you can have different objectives, but it's really, really important to start from a place of respect. You should never underestimate the intelligence of your audience, but you should never overestimate how much they know about a subject. I mean, and that is true for scientists too. I'm a neurobiologist by training, and if I have a physicist who starts talking to me as if they were talking to a colleague, I'm not gonna get it. I don't understand the language. I don't understand the jargon. And so that's something that I wanted to mention. In terms of literacy and education in Puerto Rico, I mean, we're not really faring great. I don't remember the numbers from the top of my head, but in terms of proficiency levels in science and mathematics, which is what's usually measured, we're not doing great. And you know, one of the areas in which Ciencia Puerto Rico has been focusing on has been, and how do we improve scientific education? How do we improve scientific literacy by bringing the process of science to the classrooms? We have we partner scientists with teachers to do this, and so there are a lot of deficiencies in that sense in Puerto Rico, but that is something that we are trying to address through some of our programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a bit like Joana, I have great admiration for any projects like that in countries where maybe the race is starting from, you know, from a little bit back compared to other places, and you know, kudos for being on the ground and trying to get the children to learn, to be more informed citizens, and then eventually to be more able to be skeptic about wrongful information, etc. when the time comes. Now, Monica mentioned something before, which is the trust. How, you know, that it's important for the scientific community to establish trust in the public, and there may be, and if you go on the streets, you may find people who are very skeptical, who find, again, these are people that speak a strange language and that I do not trust. And I was going to ask Adriana what her ideas would be in terms of what she's seen that works, or in terms of what she's seen that works for the scientific community to gain the trust of the public, and maybe also of the governing bodies. What can scientists do to gain this trust and start addressing the community from a place of not only respect and empathy, but trust also?
Yeah, I think so. As I mentioned before, I think the definition of being a scientist has changed in these times in terms of it's not just you're not just a scientific expert, but you're just somebody who can translate that outside of your institution to the public and to policymakers to inform them of the importance of the research that happens in institutions, but also it's sort of a dual system in that you are sort of the expert who is informing the policymakers, and at the same time, they obviously have the ability to make decisions based on what the constituents are saying. So it is, I think the way to gain credibility, obviously with policymakers specifically, would be to have evidence-based research, but also think about personal stories. So a lot of times that resonates better with them. And thinking about the, I think the advocacy that they have sort of goes both ways. So the empathy and what you were saying in terms of we have to understand sort of what policymakers deal with on a daily basis and where this advocacy will fit in. But at the same time, they have to be empathetic to the constituents who are coming to them with these issues, right? And I think as for universities specifically, you know, they support in terms of funding and, you know, bills and supplements that will obviously have gone into the COVID research. But at the same time, thinking about sort of this dual aspect of your
There was a break in the call. I don't know if all of the calls, lost of the calls. We're still live on Facebook. Oh, I see Monica. Monica, you're there. Oh, everyone's there now. I think we're back. Sorry, Adriana, we lost the last couple of seconds that you said. Can you just repeat the last thought that you were sharing?
Yeah, I think the point that this is sort of a dual system, that your researchers are informing policymakers, but they also have to listen to the constituents, which is going to inform what they're doing. So it's really important to think about, as we said, the empathy and sort of the dual nature of this.
Mm-hmm. Just before going to Adriana, a section that has more to do with what you do, there's one or two other questions that I'd like to throw on the table. I had thought this one for Joana, still to do with the role of scientists. Joana, in your opinion, should all researchers be science communicators? And on the flip side, should all science communicators be researchers? What do you have to say about this question?
Well, what I think all scientists should be trained in science communication, because it's good not only for them to be trained in communicating their work for other people, because they will have to, but also because it makes them better scientists. We have data to support that when scientists are trained into being better communicators, they also become better scientists. On the other side, not all scientists should be obliged to do the same type of science communication activities. I think all of them should do some kind of activities, but each of them has to find their space. Some of them will be good at giving talks, others will be good at writing, some will be good with dealing with children, some will be good with teenagers, some will be good with hands-on. There are so many things you can do in science communication. The possibilities are never-ending. So in that regard, I think all scientists should. If you need to have a scientific background to be a science communicator, well, we've been discussing this for ages everywhere. What I feel from my experience, it helps if you have a scientific background, because you have been yourself personally through the process of building knowledge, of creating knowledge, of the writing of the papers, of writing grants, and the frustration of the everyday work of a scientist, because many times you say science is woohoo, but science many times is pah! You know, so yeah, dealing with that, you know what you are actually communicating, and that's something I feel lacks in some people that haven't gone through the process. That being said, I know a lot of incredibly talented science communicators that don't have PhDs, so it's not mandatory. You need a mixture of qualities. From what I've been looking in the world around me, is a mixture of qualities, and you have to be sharp, and you have to be enthusiastic, and you have to be organized, and if you have a scientific background, it helps.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I feel.
Yeah, and from my interactions with people I've interviewed, one thing for sure that I feel that is clear and aligns with what you're saying is that when you have a scientific background and you're interviewing a researcher, there's an understanding of a lot of things that are happening behind the curtains, that because you were there, that you know for sure.
Yeah, I would just, I like to add that it when I started doing science communication in a research institute, it helped bringing researchers on my side, because when I was presented, people say, she's here, she wants to do some reporting on your lab, and they're like, who are you? And I said, I have a PhD, and they're like, okay, you're one of us. So it creates empathy with scientists. Okay, so it helps in that regard. It's easier to create empathy with scientists, which is also important, not just creating empathy with the other side of the audiences, because we need to bring in many scientists with us. So we really need to get them.
No, for sure. But I'm sure that there's a lot of, and there are a lot of very good research journalists who work mainly on science, and who have accrued a host of knowledge from years of working in the domain, who are very good science communicators for sure. But I agree, it helps. It helps. Now another question, and maybe throw this on the table for anyone who wants to answer, is around you. Have you felt that scientists feel a moral how to say a moral responsibility to intervene and to dispel fake news and erroneous information around them? And you yourselves, now you don't go in an elevator with anyone these days, but in the past, in an elevator conversation, you hear someone saying something that's not quite right. Do you think scientists that you know and yourself feel this need to set things right in terms of scientific information in the wild, let's say?
I can answer. I would love to hear Adriana and Monica's views on this. Well, yes and no. Yeah, it depends, because I've had a couple of dinner parties ruined because of this, because sometimes anti-vaxxers or homeopaths want to pick a fight because they know I'm from science, and they're like, let's discuss, and then it's not very good. It doesn't create a very good environment if you're discussing how bogus it is, whatever it is they are discussing. So up to a point, socially, it can be problematic, because, and there's another thing why we need the proximity and the empathy, because the anti-vaxxers and the fake news in general, they juggle with people's emotions and with people's basic fears, and not everybody knows everything, and it's really hard to make people change their minds. It's easier to help them build a good idea on something, but it's super hard to change their minds. So yeah, yes and no.
Does anyone else want to weigh in?
Adriana, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, so from sort of the university perspective, and also from my perspective, because I'm a former urban scientist who's transitioned into policy, so I sort of have both of these. I do think that it's important, as you guys have already said, to teach scientists how to communicate and be credible in society, and thinking about, I think, I don't know, but well, fake news specifically, obviously, we're trained to find reputable sources and, tell people, okay, go here, don't go to this website. I think we're trained in that. But in terms of kind of making that credible to the public, I heard this one thing. I took this class with science communication a couple of years ago from ASBMB, and they said that the public is more likely to trust when their friend says something as when a scientist says something, because they already know, I trust this person. And so we need to create, I think, that level of sort of, or closeness or credibility to say that you're just talking to them like another person. You're not like the science, like I mean, this has been reiterated multiple times, that you're not just, high on your pedestal, I'm the scientist, and talking to you and you don't know what you're saying. There are ways to connect and find sort of what the common ground is with the public, right, in that sense. So I think there is a community engagement here too, especially coming again from the university community, in terms of scientists getting out there more, talking to people, like things like, beer with a scientist, that sort of thing. With COVID also, there have been students from campuses doing sort of a lot of things in the community. So I think, it's really important to continue this engagement with outside groups as well.
Yeah, I will add, there is a really fantastic article that Liz Neely from the Story Collider wrote for The Atlantic. It's titled How to Talk About the Coronavirus. And in it, Liz is an incredible science communication researcher and practitioner. And she offers like 4 tips to help people engage with, particularly scientists, engage with others around the coronavirus. But I think her advice is relevant when you're correcting misinformation or you're addressing misinformation. I think scientists, from my experience, it drives scientists insane to see misinformation because, we're data driven, we're facts driven. It's the way that we are trained. And so because of that, we approach the world in that, fact-based manner. And we often forget not everyone approaches the world with those same values. So it's very important that we remember that. While you might prioritize facts, the reality is that facts alone don't make a difference for most people. For scientists, they may, but for most people, it doesn't make a difference. And so if you're trying to correct or address misinformation, just throwing facts at people, not going to work. Saying to someone, you're wrong, I'm right, not going to work. Not a great way to start a conversation. And so from Liz's article, I think one of the pieces of advice, or 2 of the pieces of advice that really resonate with me and with what we're talking about is you have to pick your battles. Sometimes you will be in a position to address misinformation with whoever it is that you're engaging with. And so if you are in that position, sure, do that. But say that, you're talking to someone, to use Joana's example, if you're talking to an anti-vaxxer who's already digged their heels and say, like, it doesn't matter what you say, I don't believe you, these are my beliefs on vaccines, then maybe that's a battle you shouldn't fight. And so I think it's important to understand that it's not always our place to address misinformation, and you might not always be the right messenger to do so. And the other thing is, starting where you are, start with what you have and do what you can, start where you are. And so as Adriana was mentioning, if you're amongst the group of friends, like, talk to them as a friend, like, talk to them as somebody that they might trust. Like, when I talk to my family, like, I have like chats, like WhatsApp chats with friends and family. They're constantly sending me videos and posts and whatever it is about coronavirus. And, some of them contain misinformation. And so what I've done is I know that they trust me. I know that they love me. And so from that place of trust and love, I talk to them and I say, I know that you might be sharing this because you care about me and you're worried about this issue. I wanted to let you know there's some things in that video, for example, that are wrong. Here are the things that are wrong. Here are the things that are right instead, or here are the steps that you can take if you're concerned about this particular thing. And so I would encourage people to go and read that article, because I think it offers really great advice that applies beyond this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I will share it whenever I post, and then I take care of the video for sure. And I'm going to read it because I think it's really it makes interesting points from what you're saying. Now we've hit the 1 hour mark, but I really wanted to talk about policy a little bit and go more into Adriana's domain. Is everyone ready to talk maybe 15 minutes more? Monica, you good?
I have a hard stop at the half hour.
Okay, I think we're gonna make.
I can stay. Yeah, I can stay for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes.
Okay, so I'll go straight to that. But thank you for your input. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I think a lot of very important things are being shared around the table, and I hope the people that are on the live on Facebook are appreciating that too. I see little hearts popping up on the Facebook page, so I think it's a good sign. Now, in this part, I wanted to. I've named it, Can Policies Tip the Scales? And my first question is for Adriana. Apart from universities and scientific societies and organizations like we've talked up till now, could governments also weigh in? And we all around the table know the answer to this, but and we've even said that only governments can be the final, decider in the end. But being from your position of being in DC, what does that engagement look like from the federal point of view? What have you seen in terms of initiatives, programs that have been making a difference ever since the crisis started?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this comes down to funding. So governments can support universities and also other entities that relate to research and education. There have been bills and supplements coming out, multiple ones, around supporting COVID-19 research, vaccines, testing, community events, a lot of different angles of this. And I think if we're talking about policymakers specifically, obviously they're busy people, they have a lot of priorities. They have, as I said, they like to hear from constituents. They have the ability to appropriate funds for research and so on. So I think a lot of this, the sort of the engagement from the government and policy side has been to hear, the advocacy that comes in around COVID issues and also financially supporting universities.
Mm-hmm. Now, I had the chance of listening to a conversation that Joana had in Portugal, in Portuguese, not so long ago. And Joana talked about what's been happening in Portugal and how government has been doing right there in managing with the crisis, the pandemic. So, Joana, you mentioned, and I heard you mention, that Portuguese government has done a very good job in terms of taking decisions and implementing measures based on the input of specialists and of scientists from the medical and scientific community. Can you share with us what you think worked well in the Portuguese case so far and why?
Yeah, well, we are extremely fortunate and we are grateful because, as you know, in Europe we are usually paired more with Italy and France and Spain than with Denmark or Austria, and actually have numbers more similar to those countries than to the Latin ones. And one of the key here was that government listened to scientists and they promoted the lockdown early, not like the other countries locked down much later. The government in Portugal locked down when still nobody had died in Portugal and decided to lock down. It was a bit controversial at the time because people were like, why are we locking down? We don't have that many cases. But they considered it was strategic to lock down early because scientists told them it was important to do so, because we had learned since December the crisis had begun in China and had been coming, and we know what helped the numbers being maintained low is early lockdown works. And so it was very important. And also all the authorities have always been listening to doctors and to scientists and epidemiologists and virologists. And one other thing that the government did here is that they really they went out of their way to make processes more flexible, because in order to get those testing that I talked to you about in the beginning, we had to create new rules, because otherwise we had to wait like a year to get the testing approved and the protocols approved and everything approved. So we had to do it was a political decision to accelerate the process in order to have science helping society. And it's an incredible time for science, but I imagine in your countries, most of your countries as well, is because nowadays we used to struggle. We never had science on television and on the news pieces on television, and now we have every day a scientist commenting on reality, and they're talking about stuff, and they're talking about the virus, and they're talking about the protection measures, and they're talking about health or the sociology of it. The social sciences have been playing a very important role. So actually having good scientists and listening to them and then making the politic decisions, which are politics and not science, it's crucial. It's really, really, really important.
And I've heard, I've read an article actually today explaining how in Portugal, universities, so research institutions, university research institutions were allowed to take part in the testing, in the PCR testing.
Yes.
How did that happen? How did that change? Was that a game changer in your opinion?
Completely a game changer, because one of the things we need is to test a lot of people, and in order to test a lot of people with just the state's power, it would have not been possible. And so not only in my university, but in many other research institutes in Portugal, we all came together and everybody wanted to give their time and their reagents to do the testing and to take their machines, their PCR machines. And since we are stopping all the regular work we are doing, all the PCR machines were into testing. So that is really important. And now the university, well, next week I'll be giving my body to science once more, because the University of Lisbon is studying our population, and they want to see the prevalence of the virus, and also they're doing serological tests. So we are all, well, volunteering. I'm volunteering to be one of the subjects doing the testing, because we know there are a lot of asymptomatic carriers, but until we test large and far, we really don't know how many. So with the increased capacity of collecting the samples and doing the tests, we will be able to do testing widely in Portugal.
Mm-hmm. So clearly, to allow labs that are not part of the state structure to do this testing, there were also accelerated approval of policies for that too, for sure. And now my question to Adriana is, I know the United States is a different machine, different states. It's a different dynamic than a small country at the corner of Europe with 10 million people and one government. But what are you seeing in terms of the U.S. scientists engaging with policymakers on the different issues we've discussed so far? And maybe this is not to do with what you do every day, maybe a little bit, but also what you're seeing in the news in this sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of this has existed before and is amplified now because of COVID, in terms of thinking about how universities can send the right message to policymakers. A lot of what is going on is obviously advocating for projects within biomedical research and also infectious disease now. And as I mentioned, sort of this environment creating more collaborations between universities and sort of the public and the outside stakeholders. I think some sort of typical ways to engage policymakers would be basically doing advocacy on Capitol Hill through Capitol Hill Days, which are designated times of the year when specific groups advocate for their cause, briefings where we would have researchers from campus talk about what they do, and we have staffers listening to that. And so again, it's sort of, a dual thing where you're thanking them for their support, but you're saying, here's what we're working on, and they're obviously will be informed by that as well. So a lot of this comes back to sort of showcasing the importance of research for policymakers. And then with COVID specifically, I think there has been more engagement in the community. So as has been said, scientists volunteering to do testing and that sort of thing. I think engaging them also in outside activities. So a lot of times you'll see a policymaker going to, visit a lab, or if they're they'll be at a scientific society, for example, talking to students, looking at their poster. So it's important to engage them not only where they are on Capitol Hill, but also to kind of get them out of that and, so they can see really where the research is being done and how that happens. And we've been doing that, through virtual briefings, because this is obviously the environment that we're in, but we're still trying to maintain that. So I think, that's kind of the dual type of engagement, which is on the Hill, but also outside in the community, and getting them to see how the research is being done.
Very, very, very cool. I imagine that then the different states also have different initiatives that might be happening, but it's interesting to see. It's interesting to see that going on the field and getting a view of what's happening in the labs is something that's happening, and that's probably making policymakers more aware of the reality of things, of the time frame that things take in science, especially in the life sciences. Very, very cool. I think we've reached the final point of the interview. We've talked about a lot of very interesting things. I was just going now to go around the table and ask for a last comment. Monica, do you want to share something with people who might be listening and who might be stressed about COVID, stressed about reopening? Untimely reopening. Do you want to just share some last words?
Well, that's a heavy task. I mean, it is very normal to be worried, to be concerned. What I will say is continue practicing, precautionary measures, using masks properly, washing your hands, using hand sanitizer if you don't have access to soap and water, social distancing or physical distancing. I encourage people to stay connected to their social circles, but definitely distance from people if you can. If you can stay at home, please do so. I do understand that this is not a privilege everyone has, and that this pandemic has disproportionately impacted marginalized communities, but continue taking care of yourself. Unfortunately, it's going to be a marathon. We're going to be living with this virus for a while, so it's very, very important that we look at trusted sources, scientifically based sources, because information is power. And so look for science-based information to make your decisions. Reach out to your scientist friends, and on social media, I'm certainly available to answer questions from people, and just continue to take care of yourself. And ask your representatives or elected officials to demand that they're making decisions based on science.
Very, very, very good. Adriana, on your side, any last words?
So not specific advice, but I think what I would want people to take away is sort of my concern with what's happening with the young scientists that are in the system currently and wanting to stay in science or going into different careers, and how COVID has changed that. And there needs to be, I think, more attention to how the pandemic has affected sort of their careers and what they're going through now. So more on that, hopefully.
Thank you. Joana, some last words for the audience.
Well, my last word will go out to the scientists. One word of thanking for their effort and for their effort in communicating and to be clear to us, but also to those that are commenting out of their scientific area, that maybe they should think twice, because it's really important that we continue to earn the trust of the public. So We need scientists out there. We need scientists talking, but we need to choose the way. Well, Monica was saying to choose our battles, but scientists have to talk about what they know. And when we are talking about hypothesis, we'll talk about hypothesis for everybody, not just I think this, or because we need. As scientists, we need to communicate what we know, and we can also communicate what we don't know. So, and that should be very clear. We should avoid the gray areas and giving opinions that can be misproven. Well, all opinions can be misproven by science because that's part of science. But there are things we already know, and there are a lot of things that we don't know. So it's super important, Monica's advice on wash your hands, keep your distance, be safe. Let's continue to talk together and be here on this planet, and let's kick COVID off.
Thank you. On this message of stay safe, which is and keep your distances, we're going to end this roundtable. I had a really great time. I think that we touched a lot of interesting points. So I want to thank you all, Monica, Adriana, Joana, for having given me some of your time, me and the public, to come and share a little bit and discuss a little bit on this thematic and on this new reality that we're living, and that's changing a little bit every day. So thank you, and let's keep up the good work wherever we are around us. And if we want to discuss something with someone from a place of respect, of friendship, if possible, and don't pick fights. It's not the moment for that. Thank you so much.